Good morning or good afternoon to you all. My name is Alex Cook, and I'm a volunteer at Genocide Watch, working, among other things, on issues related to China. Genocide Watch is the coordinating organization of the Alliance Against Genocide, an international coalition of over 100 organizations dedicated to ending crimes of genocide and other forms of mass murder. We're delighted to partner with another Alliance member, the International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China, as well as Global Rights Compliance, to host today's webinar on people's tribunals and business and human rights. Specifically, we'll be talking about forced organ harvesting in China and the mechanisms that have been set up to try to end it. But the principles and strategies that the panelists will share can and should be applied in other contexts as well. As for our esteemed panel, I'm joined by some of the most qualified people in the world to speak on this topic. Mr. Cheng Pei-ming is the first known survivor of the forced organ harvesting campaign carried out by the Chinese regime against prisoners of conscience. Transplant experts have confirmed that sections of Mr. Cheng's liver and left lung have been surgically removed. The forced removal happened in a Chinese hospital while he was imprisoned for the spiritual practice of Falun Gong. Mr. Cheng later escaped from China to Thailand, and we are honored that he's joining us today to tell his story. Charles Lee is one of the authors of a medical report verifying the validity of Mr. Cheng's scans and will also help translate as needed. Alexa Jeremy is currently the legal and communications manager of the International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China, which is a human rights charity dedicated to ending forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience in China. Ending Transplant Abuse in China works in the UK, Australia, the US, Canada, New Zealand, and Europe, and is primarily a coalition of lawyers, academics, medical professionals, and researchers. Alexa specifically is legally trained with experience in both corporate and human rights law, and a career background combining strategic and legal advice with workplace mediation and conflict resolution in the public, private, and international arenas. Finally, Laura Strangways, who is in a meeting but will join us in a few minutes, is a senior legal advisor and the head of business and human rights at Global Rights Compliance. She's consulted extensively with governments, non-governmental organizations, and multilateral institutions, and oversees the delivery of multi-year programs to address systemic adverse human rights impacts in global supply chains. As a reminder, the webinar is being recorded, so please keep yourself muted. After all of the panelists have presented, there will be a Q&A, so feel free to raise your hand or put your questions in the chat. I will also add into the chat the links of several great resources that will be discussed today, including the China Tribunal's judgment, the GRC legal advisory report, and the GRC policy guidance. And with that, let's get started. So to begin, I'd like to turn it over to Alexa to talk a bit more about forced organ harvesting and the China Tribunal.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thanks very much for the opportunity to speak today. Hello, everyone. As you heard in the introduction, I'm Alexa Jeremy, and I work for ETAC. So today, I'd like to speak to you about the China Tribunal, which was initiated by ETAC in 2018, the outcome of the tribunal, and what has happened since the tribunal's judgment. But before I do, I'd like to talk a little bit about organ trafficking, and in particular, forced organ harvesting in China. So firstly, it's worth stating that organ trafficking and forced organ harvesting is very much an unseen and very lucrative form of human trafficking. Excuse me. There is an extreme shortage, global shortage of organs, so the demand far outstrips the supply that's available through national transplantation programs, which, as you know, tend to have waiting times of months or years, or people don't actually get an organ at all. Inevitably, this has driven a black market for organs, and the revenue of which generates between 800 million and 1.7 billion US dollars annually. So believe it or not, the retail price for your pancreas is between US dollars 110,000 US dollars and 140,000 US dollars. So the instances of transplant tourism, which is where people pay to travel to other countries to undergo transplantation surgery, often in very short timeframes, has increased twofold in the last 20 years and now accounts for over 10% of the world's transplants. So often, and this is worth noting, there is no proper consent from the donor. So this amounts to a really large amount of unethical conduct. So now I'm going to move on and tell you a little bit more about forced organ harvesting in China. For at least 2 decades, the government of China has been accused of harvesting organs from prisoners of conscience without consent, primarily people who practice the Buddhist and meditation practice, as Alex mentioned, of Falun Gong, and Uyghur Muslims. So where does this evidence begin? Well, the evidence that forced organ harvesting in China is taking place is complex, with multiple lines of evidence coming together to expose the planned, systematic, institutional, and intentional organ harvesting that's taking place. It began prior to 2000, when there were a few transplants in China, with numbers gradually increasing following advances in immunotherapy. But during this period, organs were primarily sourced from death row prisoners, which was internationally condemned. But as far back as 1994, Human Rights Watch reported that other non-violent criminals and political prisoners were also being drawn into the organ pool during that time. So they also reported in this report that Chinese doctors participated in pre-execution medical tests and that executions were deliberately mishandled to ensure that prisoners were not yet dead when their organs were removed, which doesn't really bear thinking about. From 2000, there was a rapid increase in the number of transplants, and the source of the organs underpinning this high level of activity has never been explained in a credible way by the Chinese government, with the number of transplants taking place far exceeding the number of death row prisoners that were executed. But interestingly, this huge increase in organ transplants coincided with the repression and mass arrest of prisoners of Falun Gong during the 2000s. So although multiple reports from credible sources about forced organ harvesting in China, very little was actually being done about it at this time. So through ETAC's work, it became obvious that there were still a lot of people who were very unsure if the issue was real and if the evidence and investigations were credible. So ETAC decided to approach a barrister and an expert in crimes of mass atrocity, Sir Geoffrey Nice KC, who recommended that a People's Tribunal be formed. So although the tribunal was initiated by ETAC, I want to stress here that there was real scrupulous separation between ETAC and the tribunal. And ETAC was at no stage privy to the tribunal's deliberations and was very much responsible for the logistics. So specifically, the tribunal's mandate was to conduct an independent legal analysis and to hear and assess evidence to determine whether forced organ harvesting is occurring in China, and if so, what, if any, international crimes have been committed. So just to discuss a little bit about the evidence that was examined, joining Sir Geoffrey Nice were 7 other experts, including a transplant surgeon. And together, they carried out the first extensive independent review of all available evidence. They heard from over 70 witnesses, reviewed documentary evidence, and listened to undercover telephone calls to hospitals in China, where it was confirmed that waiting times for as little as 2 weeks. Doctors in those hospitals confirmed those very short waiting times. So this evidence, if you'd like to see it, is actually available to all of you. I think Alex might put it in the chat. So you can watch all of the testimonies and read the judgment at the chinatribunal.com. And it's worth noting that China, the PRC, didn't engage in the hearings despite being invited on numerous occasions. So on to the judgment. After assessing all the available evidence over a period of 18 months, in its 2020 judgment, the China Tribunal unanimously concluded, beyond reasonable doubt, that there was a state-sanctioned regime of forced organ harvesting, and that China has been forcibly harvesting organs from prisoners of conscience for many years. It also concluded that Falun Gong practitioners were the main source of organ supply. So in effect, people are being killed to order, and it's really nothing less than that. Donors are selected and killed so their organs can be made available for paying recipients, both from China and from abroad. So in terms of developments since the judgment, for ETAC, the China Tribunal was a real game changer because it was such a robust analysis of all the available evidence, which was also readily available on the ETAC website and the China Tribunal website. So it could be accessed by governments and NGOs and anyone else who wanted to see it. And before that, there were a range of reports and testimonies and evidence, but it was really difficult for people to read it all and piece it all together. And so the China Tribunal provided a full evidence picture, and the judgment has been recognized by international institutions and governments around the world and continues to be influential today. So there've been a great number of significant developments since the judgment, and I'll run just through a few to give you an idea of what's happened. So following the judgment, we had 12 UN special rapporteurs and human rights experts who issued a joint correspondence to the Chinese government regarding the credible evidence of forced organ harvesting from ethnic and religious minorities, including the Falun Gong and Uyghurs. And this is, of course, significant because this communication wouldn't have been issued to a UN member state about such grave violations if the evidence wasn't credible. In terms of NGOs, many more NGOs have now stepped forward to support this issue. We have around 70 NGOs who've been willing to put their name behind the issue and sign on to joint letters and other initiatives. So we're really building a coalition of supporters with a broad remit covering modern slavery, human trafficking law, medical ethics, genocide, freedom of religion and belief, and of course, human rights. So if you are an NGO in the audience and you would like to know more, please be in touch and we can arrange a time to meet. Since the judgment, the European Parliament has passed a resolution on reports of continued organ harvesting in China, and the speeches at this debate were really powerful, so clearly they accept the evidence is credible too. In the US, the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Bill has passed in the House and is progressing to the Senate. And in December last year, the Falun Gong Protection Act was also introduced. So in regards to other legislation, Israel, Spain, Taiwan, Italy, Norway, Belgium, South Korea, and the UK have all strengthened their laws in various ways. And in terms of medical societies, we've had the International Society for Heart and Lung Transplantation. They took a really powerful step and updated their policy to exclude Chinese surgeons from presenting at their conferences and publishing in their journal. And the Canadian Medical Association has issued a really strong statement condemning organ harvesting in China. So as you can see, the China Tribunal has been a really important step in addressing this crime of mass atrocity. So finally, I just want to touch on the GRC advisory, which Lara will speak to shortly. But in 2021, ETAC approached the international law firm Global Rights Compliance, or GRC, for a legal advisory. To extend our work and enable us to reach a range of stakeholders, we wanted to know what business and human rights obligations medical institutions and other associated with transplantation medicine have when partnering with China. So, for example, when training surgeons, undertaking research or publishing research from China in that field of organ transplantation medicine, and whether the UN guiding principles on business and human rights apply. So we also wanted to know what potential complicity risks exist when interacting with China in the field of transplant medicine research and training. So again, the GRC advisory has been really highly influential. And since the publication, we've been involved in numerous educational events, including for nurses and for lawyers. So we've been also approaching various stakeholders to inform them of their obligations and the risks involved and what policies they can and should be putting in place. So raising awareness about this is one of the major pillars of ETAC's work at the moment. And as I'm sure it will become clear from Lara's presentation, complicity in these egregious human rights abuses is far easier than you may think. Anyway, that concludes my presentation. Thank you everyone for listening, and I'll hand you over to Lara if she's here, or if not, Mr. Cheng.
Thanks a lot, Alexa. Laura, take it away.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'd like to echo thanks for joining us today for this session on the Legal Advisory Report and Supplementary Policy Guidance, Do No Harm, which we launched in 2022. I'm going to use the next 10 minutes to give a broad overview of the advisory and the policy guidance, and the links for which I hope are posted in the chat, but if not, I'm sure that we'll post them in a second. So as Alexa mentioned, we were asked by ETAC to advise on the business and human rights obligations, medical institutions and others associated with transplantation may have when partnering with Chinese surgeons and medical institutions. This work really built on existing open source research, which illustrated that there was a risk in a number of countries that medical institutions, hospitals, centers specifically focused on transplantation medicine were engaged in partnerships that could be contributing to grave human rights abuses. So the advisory addresses the international legal responsibilities of medical institutions and transplant-associated entities, as well as the professionals that work in these institutions to prevent human rights violations. You'll see in the advisory that it focuses on a number of stakeholders that include but are not limited to hospitals, medical schools of universities, professional societies, as well as medical journals. So I should note that this is a result really of an extensive consultation and literature review that took place over 6 to 9 months, including a range of interviews with practicing transplantation medical professionals, surgeons, anaesthetists, bioethicists, as well as medical journal editors and other experts in the field. And we really aimed to understand what, if any, due diligence was being carried out to identify, mitigate, or remediate these risks. In doing so, we also hoped that the advisory would raise awareness and inform policymakers, think tanks, and other international organizations about the legal risks that arise out of these interactions, and ultimately the lack of due diligence that was being carried out in the profession. So I hope that this helps a little bit in terms of further incentivizing critical dialogue and about what actions need to be taken to respond to these issues. And hopefully we'll have some time for some Q&A if the next part of my presentation doesn't answer what the advisory was about in sufficient detail. But ultimately, the advisory begins by outlining the general landscape regarding the global trend of transplant tourism. It looks at key countries with high levels of transplant tourism and the resulting human rights risks of unethical organ transplantation, which I believe Alexa has just outlined. It also looks at transplant tourism as one of the abuses that can take place on a sliding scale. And we really do look at it in the advisory as a sliding scale of human rights violations that can arise with respect to transplantation. We essentially determine that each one comes with a varying degree of severity in terms of legal responsibility. So we start with the least severe risk of the violation of the principle of consent after death in isolated instances, the sale of organs coerced under economic duress or organized crime of organ trafficking. And then at the top of the scale, the state-sanctioned regime where organs are forcibly removed from executed prisoners and prisoners of conscience, as in the PRC. In the advisory, we go into more detail on the issue of forced organ harvesting, but as you've heard quite a bit on this issue already, I will refrain from duplicating that information. But it's important to note that the China Tribunal, we do emphasize its importance. It was the first extensive and independent review, analysis, and evaluation of a significant body of written, video, and in-person evidence on forced organ harvesting in the PRC. So it's incredibly important. We also emphasize the importance in the advisory of the joint correspondence by the 8 UN special rapporteurs, again, as I believe Alexa has talked to. I think it's worth noting that despite the China Tribunal and the UN Special Rapporteur's joint correspondence, it was obvious to us that during the consultations for this advisory that there was a sentiment articulated by a number of stakeholders operating within the profession that there is that they would require a smoking gun, that a collaborative partner is involved in unethical organ transplantation, organ trafficking, or the killing of donors through the removal of organs before acting. This was not only, well, it's not only in stark contrast to the idea of due diligence and human rights due diligence, but it also quickly attracts criminal liability for complicity in human rights abuses and international crimes. And we were shocked to see that this was the general narrative in the profession, at least of those people that we spoke to during the consultation. I think it's important to outline for all of you here that, and those of you that are perhaps not as familiar with transplantation medicine, that the carrying out of forced organ harvesting is unquestionably dependent on the support of a range of medical professionals. It has to include trained transplant surgeons, anesthesiologists, nurses, among others. So those professionals can be supported in a wide range of ways, including clinical training, professional development programs, clinical research activities, publication of research papers, and academic exchange. Obviously, the type of partnership and the potential proximity to forced organ harvesting, as well as the fact that these crimes have been publicly reported on for years, goes to show that the risk of complicity is most definitely present. And it really raises the question about why due diligence is not being carried out in relation to these interactions between professionals and about what can be done and should be done. In the advisory, we focus on aiding and abetting because it provides a broader scope of complicity than other forms. Aiding and abetting in international criminal law means the practical assistance, encouragement, or moral support, which has a substantial effect on the perpetration of the crime. So it does require that the aider and abettor knows that his actions or lack of action assisted the commission of the crime. They understood the essential elements of the crime, including the intent. I'm not going to dive very deeply into all these specifics and legal requirements. They are on page 27 onwards in the advisory. But I do want to highlight that domestic courts can exercise universal jurisdiction over international crimes, including crimes against humanity, which means that they can prosecute crimes regardless of where they are committed. So that can extend to corporate bodies, including medical institutions, where national legal systems provide for the criminal liability of businesses. So as an example, a medical institution will not necessarily be able to escape corporate criminal liability by claiming that it did not know that its activities with the Chinese entity that is alleged to be engaging in forced organ harvesting has assisted in committing the crime. This is particularly true because there's a lot of reports and evidence in the public domain and discussions in international and national forums about this issue, which could be construed as knowledge. Stakeholders should also note that there is a growing trend on a domestic level to hold those to account for complicity in international crimes. In the last few years alone, we've seen representatives of 2 French companies and 1 Swedish company, as well as 1 French company itself, charged by public prosecutors for complicity in international crimes. And these charges were brought on the basis that companies were almost indifferent to the international crimes, despite them being aware of the tacit involvement. I'm not going to go into complicity much more, but I do want to quickly touch on business and human rights responsibilities as well, because under the business and human rights frameworks, medical and transplant associated professionals and institutions also have a broad range of soft law responsibilities. For those of you that don't know about the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, they place a responsibility on states to protect human rights and on businesses to respect human rights, and on both to provide effective access to remedy. So they apply to the medical sector as much as any other business field, although responsibilities may differ depending on whether the institution is state-owned or a privately owned enterprise. both public and private medical institutions and transplant associated entities, including universities, medical schools, hospitals, clinical research centres, and transplantation societies, do have a duty to respect and protect human rights. So in the policy guidance, we do offer advice on the practical actions that medical institutions can take to ensure respect for human rights and prevent involvement in these crimes. And that does include establishing a human rights policy. It includes conducting ongoing human rights due diligence, and it includes disengaging from a partnership where that risk cannot be prevented, mitigated, or remediated. I think the human rights policy is just worth stating that looks like a public statement adopted by executive level and senior management of an institution to demonstrate respect for human rights. It should set out a commitment to preventing involvement in organ trafficking and or forced organ harvesting. And that really just signals a commitment to external stakeholders that the entity takes the risks seriously. And it's a really important first step. The development of the policy should always be based on consultations with relevant stakeholder groups. And I know that there are many stakeholders that are keen to give advice to any institutions that are willing to engage in that dialogue and begin the drafting of that type of policy. I'm going to leave it there, but I just want to point you back to the policy guidance. Obviously, the advisory provides the context, the backdrop to this issue, and the policy guidance really does dig deeper into the various steps that each stakeholder can take. So I would encourage you to all have a look at that, and please do reach out with any questions if you have any after reading it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Laura. Now I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Cheng Pei-Ming, the first known survivor of forced organ harvesting carried out by the Chinese regime. Mr. Cheng will share his story with us.
古先生，他现在要开始叫你讲你的故事。
那个我的故事你给那个简单的说一说吧。我要说你边翻译的话费时间，等到你跟他说一声，你说到我就是要提出问题的时候，我再回答，这样跟他有互动。完了，那个我的故事都大家在那个很多视频自媒体都广播过。完了，你简单有要说一下，就不用翻译，缩短这个互动的，就是那个叫提问题的时间，好吧？你跟他们说一声。
Okay. Mr. Chen just said that since his story is publicized in many places, he would like to let me to introduce his story briefly, and then if there's any questions and answers, he can join us. He's like a Falun Gong practitioner who started the practice in 1998. He was born in 1965 in the northeast part of China. So since the crackdown of Falun Gong, he has been arrested, tortured 5 times, and in 2001, in December, he was unlawfully sentenced 80 years in prison. So the torture is like never stopping, and the misery never ending. So in 2004, like in November of 16, in protesting the torture and persecution, he swallowed a paper cut blade and a nail. Then he was sent to the hospital, not the fourth hospital of Daqing City, and then he refused to do any surgery, but was held down by 6 policemen, and then was injected anesthesia. He woke up in November 19th. So he did not know what happened, but he was shackled to the bed and has IV drips, that kind of things, and has a big cut on his chest. So then he He was later transferred back to the prison, which is November 23rd. After that, in 2005, he heard the inmates circling around the rumor saying that he underwent a transplant surgery, which he did not understand fully at that time. But in 2006, in March 2nd, he was again forcibly taken to another hospital in Dajin City. And his family members, his sisters, was told by the police that he swallowed another knife, and in a critical condition, and need to be operated on. And he actually did not swallow any blades or things like that. So that was a kind of setup. But we also believe that the first time in 2004 is also a setup. But anyways, he was watched by two policemen, and in the morning, like 2 a.m., he went to the bathroom across hall, and one of the policemen was sleeping. Another one watched him walk into the bathroom and coming back. But after he came back, and the policeman was so exhausted and he fell to sleep without shackling him back to the bed. So that gave him a chance to escape. So he ran down to the fire escape and took a taxi and ran away. With the help of the Falun Gong practitioners, he escaped out of Heilongjiang province. And the Ministry of the Security in China issued a warrant of arrest on him. So he was like escaping, hiding in China for 9 years, and finally, got to Thailand in 2015. So under the help of the U.S. government, he was rescued back to USA in 2020. So then we did a lot of exams on him, including 9 imagery tests, and then we have confirmed that his left liver lobe was removed surgically, and also part of his lung, lower lobe lung, on the left side was removed. So since the removal of the liver was actually taken from the chest, the cut of the chest, which is like 35 centimeters long. And the operation itself is very unusual. It's not like a normal procedure. So he has his diaphragm cut and with a nerve damaged, so that his left lung is like permanently lift up, and he had a pain in the rainy days and when he is tired and things like that, and he couldn't breathe easily. So that's the aftermath. But that we are happy about his escape, because almost all the victims of the forced organ harvesting were killed after their organs are taken. The reason that he was able to escape was because we believe that he had a unlawful sentence of 8 years by the CCP. So they might have thought that he is still usable after the first time of the organ extraction. So then they did not kill him. So that's the story. So in the process of working in his case, we got help from the ETAC, and we want to just show appreciation here. And also we appreciate the verdict by the China Tribunal. So I will just leave here and see if you guys have any questions. We can discuss back and forth. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. At this point, if anybody has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or to raise your hand. Something that I'm curious about, I think what complicates this issue particularly is that it's taking place in China, which is one of the big geopolitical powers. And many governments and businesses, not only with respect to this, but also with respect to the Uyghurs and several other issues, the international community is reluctant to take forceful action against China in fear of retribution, either political or economic or against their business. So I'm wondering, Alexa or Lara, if you have any advice or counsel for uh, people who are worried that following the best practices that GRC has published or that ETAC is advocating for, um, that it would be going a bit too far to do irreparable damage to their relationship with China by criticizing these practices.
Lara, do you want to go, or I'm happy also to speak to this a bit, Alex. We found when we are advocating, particularly with diplomatic circles, that it is really difficult, I think, because it's that very fine balance of as you said, they want to raise awareness and discuss this in bilateral dialogue, particularly with the Chinese. But equally, there are many other pressing issues as well at the moment, and it's about maintaining certain relationships. I think what ETAC would say to this is, and I think Lara might speak more to this, it's about how while we may not be able to change things going on in China, we can certainly change how we interact with them, particularly with, the way and the GRC, the advisory speaks to this, to do proper due diligence. You can disengage, there are other things before disengaging that you can do when you're interacting with China. But Lara's a little bit more qualified than I am to speak to that. But it doesn't have to be full out condemnation, although of course it can be, but there are other things that can be done.
Yeah, absolutely. And the one thing that I would build on is when we're talking about human rights policy commitments, even getting medical institutions to write a policy without specifying a country, but just specifying the issue is a good first step. So where they commit to undertaking due diligence on forced organ harvesting and organ trafficking in their interactions and what steps that looks like. Often you find that governments are prepared to talk about issues rather than countries, and where institutions are not prepared to call out countries in particular, that might be a good way forward. And again, we talk about risk. So this goes back to the smoking gun point that where there is risk of human rights violations, it's important that companies and institutions carry out due diligence. It's not to say that there has to be this smoking gun. It's not to say that by carrying out due diligence, you are saying something. It is just part and parcel of responsible conduct in terms of your interactions to ensure that you're doing that type of due diligence. So it can be framed in a number of ways to kind of get around that issue. And if anybody wants to talk more specifically about their difficulties with trying to get an institution to commit to this practice because of worries about the retaliation measures that the PRC might take, then my inbox is always open to discuss how that can be addressed.
Thanks, Lara. And while we're talking about the importance of not focusing only on China, can either you or Alexa give us an overview of where else in the world this is happening besides China that we should be focusing on?
Well, we focus entirely on China, forced organ harvesting happening in China. And although human trafficking, organ trafficking is happening across the world, there are hotspots, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, for example. Our focus is China. And we haven't, as far as I know, heard of any other instances yet of forced organ harvesting elsewhere.
The case in Nigeria that came to the UK was helpful in raising the profile even of the issue of organ trafficking in itself. I think sometimes due to the subject matter, it feels that it is not something that might go on here, or that there may not be involvement in it. But I think that case in the UK really brought to the front that this is a current issue, that this is something that institutions need to be thinking about and protecting themselves against. But yeah, state-imposed forced organ harvesting, that's on the higher end of the scale and is a fairly unique instance.
And what do you all believe is the purpose of state-sponsored forced organ harvesting? Is it to make money because organs are quite valuable? Is it possibly genocidal to eliminate Falun Gong practitioners? As we heard, many of those who have had their organs taken have died, and that may be a way of eliminating an entire group of people.
The issue of genocide, of course, came up at the tribunal, and it's a controversial one. It's an extremely high bar to reach, of course. Some experts believe it is genocide, others not. So it's currently a debate. I mean, for us, it's crimes against humanity, you know. So for us, that is the main thing. Sorry, Alex, if you could just repeat your question a little bit about. Oh, and so sorry. It was about whether it's genocide or what is our. Well, it's obviously a very, very lucrative industry, and you heard some of the figures that I spoke about. So of course that's one factor. Whether or not it's genocide, I don't think I'm qualified to say, but it is coincidental that it does coincide with a number of people who are threatening to the regime, the Falun Gong, the Uyghur. So, you know, it's a number of aims, I would say.
Sure. And the China Tribunal, Alexa, was not a legally authoritative body. Is there any legal recourse? I know you talked about some of the resolutions that countries have passed, or some of the actions that businesses are taking. But what other ways are there to hold perpetrators of this accountable? Or, as we talked about before, does China's size and influence and power on the global stage sort of insulate the main actors of this from accountability?
Well, there are different ways. So you've seen that legislation has been brought in various countries. The US has brought in some quite specific legislation, and stuff is coming through also at the moment. We can initiate sanctions. So that's another way that we can work. To create pressure. And then, of course, Lara spoke to it, but universal jurisdiction is perhaps another route. There are a number of different things, but all take creativity and thinking. Lara, do you have anything else on that one?
No, just to say that I think we obviously focused on this group of stakeholders for a reason, because they do have responsibilities to check that there is consent of donors in their day-to-day practice for business and human rights responsibilities. So that was really the aim of this advisory, is to use that accountability avenue. And of course, we are exploring other ways. But from a business and human rights perspective, medical institutions do have a responsibility to be doing this due diligence, and that can't be, that has to be preventative rather than reactive. So yeah.
Great. We have a question from Brad, who wants to know, as far as we know, how long has this been going on for? Maybe Alexa, you can answer that.
Yeah, so I mean, it's at least a couple of decades that China's been accused of harvesting organs from prisoners of conscience. So yeah, for the last 20 years or so that we know of. And as I mentioned, you know, it was 1994 that Human Rights Watch reported on other people other than non-violent criminals and political prisoners were being drawn into the pool for organ harvesting as well. So yeah, about 20 years that we know of.
And do you have a sense of the acceleration or the deceleration? Have the number of victims grown over time, or are they decreasing?
There have been estimations, I think it came up in the tribunal that it was between 60 to 100,000 operations being performed a year. But it's very, very difficult to get any information from China. It's increasingly so actually since the tribunal.
Great. And Jeremy points out that a strong next step might be to bring a case against an organization alleged to be complicit in this. Is ETAC or anybody else that you know of working to do this, or to create a coalition of NGOs that might take this on?
We are discussing it at the moment, yeah. Yeah.
Fantastic. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to chime in. Otherwise, I would ask, Laura had to drop off, so I can pass along any questions anybody has for her. Otherwise, I would ask either if Alexa or Charles and Mr. Chang have any other final comments, motivational words, plans for the future that we can help with, or ways that we can be active. We already discussed so many great ways, but any final words, Alexa?
No, just to thank everybody. I realized my video was off. Sorry, I'd hidden my self-view and I realized no one else could see me as well. So apologies for that. But if you are an NGO or anyone else that would like any more information, then please do feel free to email me. And yeah, please do get in touch. It's always great to combine forces and ideas and brainstorm. So you are always very welcome.
Thank you, Alexa. And Charles and Mr. Chang, anything you'd like to leave us with?
Yeah, I think this is Mr. Chang's case is the first one who survived the organ harvesting, and the actual scale of the forced organ harvesting is much more than what we have been hearing, like 60 to 100,000 cases a year, because we have analyzed the hospital, like about 1,000 hospitals in China who have been doing this. So I don't want to mention any numbers because this might be like too scary for people to hear. The other thing I want to mention is that we should not have any fear of retaliation from the CCP, because if we have a fear in our heart, then it gives more space for the CCP to expand their evilness, because the CCP is the biggest threat to humankind at this moment. And in the United States, people have come to the realization of this fact that China, the CCP, is the biggest enemy of the USA, but also for the entire human being. A lot of people don't understand this because they're brainwashed, and also their interest in business and other things. They are afraid of losing their interest, things like that. So, but we have to face it. So it's possible you might have some short-term loss in terms of business or anything like that, but in the long run, you have to like overcome this fear. So that's my comments. Let me ask Mr. Chen，古先生，你现在有没有什么评论啊，或者是还有什么事情要跟大家讲的？陈先生。
OK，我现在说两句。现在我面临巨大的威胁，就是中共派了，他有个国安部、公安部，派出很多组对我立案，进行对我谋杀。 就是让我闭嘴，不让对那个活摘器官作为这个第一证人幸存的这个人在这发声。
Yeah, he's saying that the CCP has make a big fuss of his case. Actually, I want to mention that in October of this year, they made up a kind of history on him, claiming that the reason he was sent to the hospital for surgery is to rescue his life. But we have a lot of evidence, and also the falsified case had a lot of contradictory by itself. Like they say, the knife was taken out through the mouth by endoscopy. Then the doctor says, the knife, the blade actually is kind of rusty, but they had a picture of the blade, which is clean, not rusty. And also they did not have any other pictures from the previous operation, like if they had a X-ray and all those things. There's nothing like that in the falsified case. But for him, they're trying to ask him to shut up, sort of threatening his life. And they send a group of spies, that kind of people, sort of threatening to assassinate him in the United States. So that's what we are facing right now.
中共他知道活摘器官的证人的存在，他们非常可怕。他们知道这是中共的邪恶的本质，人类上从来没有的罪恶。他们害怕，因为这件事情揭露，全世界都认清之后，他们会解体。每个国家都不会跟他有外交，因为他是个魔鬼。
Yeah, he said that the CCP itself realized that this forced organ harvesting has been, if it's been consolidated by the fact, like we have witnessed and all the other evidence, that people will realize that the CCP itself is evil and it will come to an end. So that's why they are so afraid. They wanted to take actions against Mr. Chen.
如果起诉中共的罪恶，我是活摘幸存者，我出来当第一证人起诉他。
So if there's a lawsuit against CCP about this crime, he would be stand out to be a plaintiff.
感谢你们对这个法轮功遭受的苦难的关注，感谢你们伸出援助之手，制止中共这场活摘器官的罪恶。
Thank you guys all for supporting the practitioners of Falun Gong and your efforts in ending these crimes against humanity.
Thanks. And Charles, one more question from somebody in the audience who wants to know, since you mentioned the numbers around this are so high that you don't even want to share them, where do you get your evidence from? Ellie, who asked the question, works in the field and is also thinking of the best ways to collect evidence on the subject. So do you have any tips for people who are?
Yeah, it's an effort by the WOPAC, the World Organization to investigate the persecution on Falun Gong. We have collected a lot of news reports and academic papers, things like that. They mentioned how many cases of, let's say, liver transplants or kidney transplants they did every year. So that was like back to 2015. So then we have compared all the cases from those hospitals in China to the United States, and we find out the total actually. The thing is that it's kind of difficult to really iron down, but we are in the efforts to do so. But the estimated like the amount of transplantation in China back in 2010, and something like that is like 30 to 50 times more than that in the United States. So the reason I don't want to share this is because it sounds unbelievable. So that's why when you talk about this organ harvesting to people were stunned. How could people do this kind of things, right? So the same thing is that the scale is so big. We're talking about 30, 50 times more cases in China than in the United States, which is supposed to be the biggest country in transplant business. So that was like we had all these collections of evidence from the hospitals, their websites, the publications, and all those things. It's a huge amount of work, but nowadays it's more and more difficult to collect information from China because they intentionally erase or falsify numbers. So it's a difficult job.
Great. Thanks, Charles. And we're now just about at time, so I'd like to thank our panelists, Alexa, Laura, Charles, and Mr. Cheng for joining us today and providing their insights. If anybody has any further questions, you're welcome to pass them along to me or any of the panelists, and we'll get you an answer. Additional resources are also online. I'd recommend checking out the China Tribunal judgment, as well as the GRC Legal Advisory Report and the GRC Policy Guidance. Thank you all for coming, and have a great day.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you.